Everybody, it's Johnny Two-Face here, back with another reaction video. This time reacting to Battle of Poltava 1709, Great Northern War documentary by Kings and Generals. I hope I pronounced that right. So yeah, this has been a great series so far, and if you haven't seen my reaction to the other episodes in this series, I suggest you check them out before checking this one out. And well, quickly, usual disclaimer when I react to any historical content: if I don't show so much as what is considered a proper reaction, it's probably obvious that I don't know much about the subject at hand. If I do know anything, I'll most likely pause the video, give my input, or, God, I hate being fat, or ask any curious questions, which hopefully will be answered in the comments below. So yeah, the link to the original video will be in the description down below. Please go and subscribe to Kings and Generals, another great history channel here on YouTube. So without wasting much more of your time, let's get this up on the screen and get into it. Oh, and support their sponsors if you're interested.
The Swedish victory at Fraustadt practically ended the Western theatre of the Great Northern War and left Charles XII free to return to the long-neglected Eastern Front. Peter, yet to earn his great moniker, came out wiser from his defeat at Narva. Emboldened by the gains which Russia had made in the last few years and his new and reformed army, he awaited the arrival of his greatest rival. The clash of these era-defining individuals in the next few years would be the tipping point of the war, changing European politics for the coming centuries. We're not saying that Peter having better hair than Charles played a role in this war, but it couldn't have hurt, right? Here's the truth that can hurt. 2 out of 3 guys will experience some kind of hair loss or male pattern baldness by the time they're 35. And here is another truth that can help you. The sponsor of this video, Keeps, is here to prevent hair loss. It happened to the main subscription to receive. Feel free to check them out if you're interested. In the aftermath of defeating Polish-Saxon forces and signing the Treaty of Altenstadt in October, Charles did not leave Saxony immediately, instead choosing to settle down for winter. This was primarily done so the Swedish army could rest following 6 years of nearly constant campaigning. It also served the purpose of pressuring the Saxons into gathering the war indemnities as quickly as possible. The treaty itself was not immediately signed by Augustus, as he was still in Poland with Peter. The Tsar terrified Augustus, so much so that the Elector of Saxony did not dare tell him of his unconditional surrender. It was only in the dead of winter, when Russian forces were retreating east, that Augustus could leave for Saxony. Peter was enraged after learning of the Saxon capitulation, because he knew that his position in Poland was hanging by a thread. The Russian army retreated across the Vistula and destroyed all of the bridges on the river, hoping to slow down the inevitable Swedish advance. Left without any proper allies, Peter tried to keep the Polish resistance against the Swedes alive by all means. At first, he tried to bribe and threaten the Polish nobility into not acknowledging Stanisław as king. With Poland devastated by the civil war, the vast majority of the magnates refused to fight the Swedes even if they did not support Stanisław. Having failed to rally the magnates to his side diplomatically, the Russians started brutally raiding the Polish and Lithuanian countryside, and they also besieged the important port of Gdansk. The siege was easily repelled, and military pressure proved to be impractical, as now Peter was just making more enemies. As a final desperate measure to keep the war in the Commonwealth alive, the Tsar sent an envoy to Pope Clement XI. He promised to work on reuniting the Catholic and Orthodox churches if the Holy See denounced Stanisław as king. Whether his intentions were sincere or not is unknown, though the talks broke down quickly regardless. Without allies, and with the Russian army exhausted by war, Peter went to great lengths to make peace with Charles. He even offered to return all of the conquered lands except for St. Petersburg and the forts along the Neva. The ambitious Charles XII was confident in victory, however, and said to his commanders, Gentlemen, I have resolved never to make an unjust war, but to end a just one only with the utter ruin of my enemies. I will attack the first to take the field, conquer him, and then deal with the others. Hampered by the constant arrival of foreign diplomats, the slow arrival of reinforcements, and by Augustus himself, the Swedish forces only left Saxony in the autumn of 1707. At the end of the year, Charles crossed the Vistula with his army. Peter, who was celebrating Christmas in Moscow, left for Grodno immediately after hearing of the Swedish advance. He did not stay there for long, as the city was an easy target for the unified Swedish army. Incidentally, Charles entered the city 3 days after Peter left it. During his retreat to Vilnius, Peter ordered his Cossacks and Kalmyks to ravage the countryside and burn everything that the Swedish army could use. This strategy left the Swedish army with a chronic lack of supplies. Facing starvation, they took the last supplies that the peasants had, even further devastating the area. Meanwhile, Peter grew ill in early 1708, leaving all military affairs to his generals. Ill health struck him when he was facing the worst internal disorder of his reign, the Don Cossack revolt led by Bulavin. News of Peter's failing health, as well as the revolt, made the Russian army fall into disorder. Men were deserting at an alarming rate, and morale was low. The generals were also bogged down in Mahilov, as they could not agree on whether the war should be continued with Sweden. Furthermore, 32,000 men also had to be detached from the main army in order to quell Bulavin's revolt. It was anyone's guess which way Charles would go from Grodno, into Livonia or towards St. Petersburg, towards Moscow or into Ukraine. At first, he left Grodno in a northeasterly direction. Petrified at the thought of losing his new capital, Peter ordered St. Petersburg to be additionally fortified. After forcing the city of Vilnius to resupply the army, Charles turned towards the southeast and encamped at Minsk. While there, General Leeuwenhaupt informed Charles that his army in Livonia was ready to march south and support the main army. In the following weeks, some Swedish and Russian forces exchanged fire on the outskirts of the city. This incident made Charles aware of the poor state of the Russian army. Seeing this as a perfect opportunity, Charles decided to attack the Russians at Mahilov and then directly advance towards Moscow. The Tsar ordered his generals to hold the defensive line around Mahilov at all costs, as Moscow could be easily assaulted from there. Charles decisively defeated the disorganized Russian army at the Battle of Holovchin. However, the majority of the soldiers and generals escaped unharmed to Smolensk. The bridges across the Dnieper were burned during the retreat. The Swedish soldiers were exhausted from the forced marching, food shortages, and bad weather, so they could not build new bridges for a month. After crossing the Dnieper, it became evident that the Russian forces had extensively employed scorched earth tactics. The area between Mahilov and Smolensk was completely devastated, with peasants fleeing with their cattle into the forests and leaving neither crops, tools, nor any other kind of supplies for the Swedes. Additionally, the Russian army burned down almost all buildings, leaving no sturdy shelter from the worsening weather. Seeing a direct advance towards Moscow as suicide, the Swedish command reviewed their possible options. As Charles refused to advance into Russia in the aftermath of the Battle of Narva, it came as a surprise to many that he chose to do so now. A variety of factors contributed to his decision. His belief that Ruthenia was a prosperous and resource-rich land, that the Ukrainians wanted to rebel against the Russians, and that he could expect aid from the Cossacks and Crimean Tatars. Meanwhile, a Polish army advanced into Ruthenia as well. The hetman of the Zaporozhian Cossacks, Ivan Mazepa, was worried at this confluence of several large armies into his lands. He asked Peter for military support. However, the Tsar refused, content to just shadow the Swedish army during its march. Mazepa saw this as a betrayal of a treaty between the Cossacks and Russia, and promptly allied with the Poles and the Swedes. The Russians retaliated quickly, seizing the Zaporozhian capital of Baturin, massacring all of its
Chance to winter and Base to destroy a battle.
Inhabitants and allegedly tying them to crosses and floating them down the Dnieper. The Russian army also continuously employed scorched earth tactics, depleting the land of anything useful. Trying to avoid further Russian reprisals, the Zaporozhians replaced Mazepa with a new hetman and continued fighting on the Russian side.
Wow.
The Swedish army, once again low on supplies, was eager for the arrival of the support army. Unfortunately for the Swedes, Lewenhaupt's relief force was ambushed by a Russian army at Lesnaya in late October. Due to the number of casualties and not knowing the state of the Russian force, Lewenhaupt decided to cross the Shozh River as quickly as possible. The army was forced to leave most of its supplies and artillery behind. The small force which did reach Charles was nowhere near as strong as he had hoped. Moreover, the winter of 1708 to 1709 was one of the coldest on record.
Very fast.
This, together with the scorched earth tactics, left the Swedish army in a disastrous state. Thousands of soldiers starved to death or succumbed to disease, and many simply froze to death. The Russians suffered many casualties during winter as well, though nowhere near as many as the Swedes. At the approach of spring, Charles was left with less than half of the men that he had started the campaign with. The great Cossack rebellion which he expected did not materialize. Mazepa promised tens of thousands of soldiers for the upcoming battles against the Russians, yet the number that he could realistically muster was much smaller than that. Charles's last hope was Stanisław. The Polish and Swedish forces kept regular lines of communication during their advance into Ruthenia. Since correspondence between the two forces stopped during winter, Charles assumed that the weather simply bogged down his allies' army. The reality of the situation turned out to be far more disheartening. Stanisław's armies retreated into Poland to consolidate power, and due to a miscommunication between himself and his commanders, nobody informed Charles that he was left alone. In the end, it was one of his own envoys to the Ottoman Empire that informed the Swedish king of Stanisław's position.
Wow.
Unable to advance or retreat, Charles saw only one option for his army's survival. He needed to capture a well-provisioned fort and wait until support arrived. On the 1st of May 1709, the Swedish army besieged the port of Poltava, some 300 kilometers east of Kiev. The Swedes could have taken the fort easily by force. However, Charles did not want to risk any unnecessary damage to the defenses or the grain stores. Peter saw this moment as critical. He advanced towards Poltava from northern Ruthenia and ordered most of his senior generals to assemble there with their troops. By June 15th, the entire Russian army had arrived on the east bank of the Vorskla River. Peter's primary objective was to cross the river with his army. To divert the attention of the Swedes, he sent some cavalry to feign a crossing south of Poltava. Charles then rode out of his camp to see what was happening. What occurred next was one of those minor chance events that sometimes decides the fate of nations. The Swedish king was shot in the foot by a Cossack and refused to have the wound tended to until he nearly fell unconscious. To make matters worse, this took place on June 17th, his birthday, a bad omen which further demoralized the Swedish troops. While Charles was weakened by fever, his generals could not agree on the response against the Russians. Peter used this opportunity to cross the river and set up camp north of Poltava. The camp was fortified afterwards, and a series of redoubts were built. To the rear, the Russian position was protected by the river and marshland. There was no chance of the Swedes mounting any flanking maneuvers. The Swedish army numbered around 22,000 men, with a similar amount of cavalry and infantry. They also had around 30 guns. However, the artillery was not used during the battle, since Charles anticipated a quick breakthrough. There were also around 3,000 of Mazepa's Cossacks and 1,000 Poles on the Swedish side. The Russian army had in total around 80,000 men, with over 30,000 infantry, around 20,000 horsemen, and 23 to 25,000 Cossacks and Kalmyks. The Russians also had over 100 guns. The numbers and the positions of the armies remind us of the Battle of Narva. Nevertheless, there are two important differences here. The Swedish army wasn't led by its best commander, and the Russian army had been transformed from a peasant mob into a credible fighting machine. The Swedish War Council debated on whether they should use a cautious or aggressive plan of attack. The more senior commanders in the army preferred a steady offensive, while the younger ones proposed an all-out attack. In the end, the king chose to heed the advice to strike the iron while it's hot. Unable to take part in the battle himself, Charles devised a battle plan and entrusted it to Field Marshal Rienschold. What Charles did not know was that the Field Marshal was on bad terms with most of the other generals.
Oh dear.
On account of that, he failed to relay the plans properly to them, dealing a significant blow to the organization and cohesion of the army before the battle even started. Preparations for the battle started on the 9th of July 7th. The Swedes left 2,500 men to guard the baggage train and camp, 2,000 in front of Poltava to prevent a breakout, and another 1,500 to check the Cossacks and Kalmyks. A crucial part of Charles's plan was the element of surprise, so the army started preparing to attack at night. The lack of organization became evident here, as the cavalry took too long to form up and the summer night was quite short. By the time the Swedes were ready to attack, the Russians were already alert. At 4 AM, General Rus started the Swedish offensive by trying to envelop the first frontal redoubts. The Swedes attacked relentlessly and took the first two, but they were unable to advance further. Russian artillery devastated the assaulting soldiers, and they did not have enough men left to attack the remaining redoubts. The Russian commanders still feared the Swedish troops, and asked Peter to send the infantry from his camp to aid the defenders at the redoubts. Peter decided to not make any unnecessary moves, since he knew that the Swedes were suffering heavy casualties, and that it would only be a matter of time before they lost steam. While this was happening, Löwenhaupt and Rienschold drove back the main body of the Russian army behind the redoubts. However, they did not coordinate their attacks well enough and were split up. Charles, watching the battle from afar, ordered both Rus and Löwenhaupt to reconnect with the main body of the army outside of the Russian camp. Rus had lost most of his men already and decided to retreat to a redoubt by the river, where he later surrendered. Löwenhaupt, after several hours of inconclusive fighting, led his 2,400 men through intense artillery fire to Rienschold's force. With what was left of the Swedish army united, they began advancing towards the main Russian force. It was at this point that Peter ordered the gates of the camp to be opened, and 30,000 of his infantry to array in battle lines. The cavalry subsequently formed up at the flanks. The Swedish commanders, seeing that the Russian line was significantly wider than their own, stretched the Karelians thin in an effort to avoid envelopment. While they were approaching the Russian army, Peter's artillery devastated the Swedish forces. Fearless in the face of death, the elite Swedish infantry approached until they could see the white in their enemies' eyes and unleash several musket volleys. What was supposed to be their deadliest weapon came to be almost useless. The winter cold and bad weather in the last year reduced the quality of their gunpowder, and most of the shots did not even reach the Russians. The Russian volleys, in contrast, killed many Swedes. Starving, exhausted, and hopelessly outnumbered, the entire Swedish army charged. The few units which made it to the Russian lines fought bravely before being killed. Sources tell that only the company led by Count Torstensson, grandson of the famous Lennart Torstensson, managed to penetrate the Russian lines before being enveloped and massacred together with their leader. As the defeated Swedes retreated from the battlefield, the Russian cavalry pursued them and cut down many. Meanwhile, Charles, after having his bodyguards killed by a cannonball, gathered what was left of his army and retreated south. In the end, the Swedes lost around 7,000 men, with a further 2,700 captured, including Rienschold and other top commanders. The Russians had 1,300 men killed and another 3,300 injured. Constantly pursued by the Russian army under Menshikov, Charles sought refuge in the Ottoman Empire with 1,000 of his men.
Okay.
The rest of his army, in the hands of Löwenhaupt, surrendered to the Russians at Perevolozhna 3 days after the battle. The captured commanders were kept as Peter's prisoners, while the soldiers that caused Peter so much trouble were settled in Siberia. For Sweden, the Battle of Poltava was a catastrophic defeat. Its elite continental army was annihilated, grievously reducing its defensive capabilities. Peter called his great victory at Poltava a divine miracle, as he finally managed to defeat the most formidable army in Europe. Russian armies would now be free to encroach into Poland and the Baltic without any resistance. Following nearly a decade of Swedish domination in the Great Northern War, Russia would now gain the upper hand. The war, however, was not over, and our next episode will come soon, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see it. Please consider liking, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Our videos would be impossible without our...
And that'll do it. This has been another interesting video. It's... wow. That is not how it... well, as I said, I'm not very clued up on the Northern War, but I wasn't expecting it to... wow, that really turned against the Swedes. But again, like politics, I know this is a broken I'm sounding like a broken record, but like a load of infighting doesn't help. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next episode. So anyway, if you like this reaction, please like, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you next